cold CEO named suddenly becomes a father when the woman he loved dies after giving birth to their daughter. From a lonely man, he now changes himself to become a true father. Chicago, 11:48 p.m. The glass of whiskey hadn't warmed. It sat idle in Edric's hand, untouched for nearly 15 minutes. Amber light caught inside it, flickering softly from the television's silent glow. No music, no party, just the muffled, celebratory pulse of a city that seemed to exist somewhere far beyond the four walls of his penthouse. Fireworks cracked the sky in sudden flashes, scattering red, gold, violet. Cars honked far below, and in the neighboring high-rises, shadows moved, silhouettes of people laughing, kissing, living. Edric sat still. The only movement was the slight twitch of his thumb against the cold crystal glass, like he'd forgotten what to do with his hands. He leaned back, letting the leather of the sofa fold around him. His dress shirt was still crisp, the top button undone. The room around him was immaculate, sterile almost. A home built like a showroom, curated for impressions, never for life. He shifted forward and set the glass down on the marble coffee table, its surface so clean it reflected his fingers, before he pulled them away. Somewhere, the HVAC hissed on and off. The soft creak of the wooden floor beneath his feet reminded him that even in this frozen moment, time was still moving. He glanced toward the hallway, where the door to his home office stood shut. There were 3 missed calls on his personal phone, which lay face down. He hadn't picked it up all day. His assistants knew not to disturb him on New Year's Eve. Just that every year, it felt a little harder to breathe through the silence, a little heavier in his chest. He ran a hand down his face and stood, crossing to the window. His forehead pressed gently against the glass, the cold seeping into his skin. From here, he could see Millennium Park, the curve of Lakeshore Drive, the grid of streetlights pulsing like tiny stars. People were down there, together, holding hands, toasting, making promises. He exhaled slowly. They don't know what they're promising, he thought. His gaze drifted. Across the skyline, one window flickered with candlelight, another with Christmas lights, still clinging to the edges. His eyes settled on a corner balcony 3 floors below, where a man held a child in his arms while a woman laughed beside them. He looked away. That life wasn't his. Then the phone rang, not the cell. That one had been off for hours. The landline, the one barely anyone knew existed. He turned, frowning. For a moment, he just stared at it. It sat on the edge of his kitchen counter, like something foreign, something outdated. It rang again. He crossed the floor and picked up the receiver slowly. Yes? Mr. Harris. The voice was female, professional, not cold, but not comforting either. I'm calling from St. Mary's General Hospital. I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour, but this is urgent. Edric's hand tightened around the receiver. There must be a mistake. There's no mistake, sir. A baby girl was delivered tonight at 10:43 p.m. The mother, Olivia Bennett, listed you as the father. I'm very sorry to inform you that she passed during labor. The room tilted. His grip slipped. The world didn't stop, but something inside him did. What did you say? His voice didn't sound like his own. I understand this must be a shock. Ms. Bennett gave your full name and contact. You're the only next of kin on record. He turned away from the counter, slowly, as if the motion alone might change the reality of her words. His heart thudded once, hard, like a warning. I haven't seen her in years, he muttered, mostly to himself. Sir, I need to ask if you can come in tonight. The baby is stable, but we'll need to make arrangements. Her name is Lila. The click of the call ending was quiet, almost delicate. Edric stood there with the receiver still against his ear, not moving, not thinking. Olivia. He hadn't said her name aloud in so long it felt unfamiliar, but her face came back instantly, her eyes, that half smile that always looked like she was on the edge of saying something funny. The way she used to say his name when she wanted to cut through the layers he'd tried to keep between them. She was gone. And now, there was a child. His child. He set the phone down, carefully. His hands didn't shake. They were too cold for that. Then he walked to the hallway closet, pulled on his coat without rushing, picked up his keys from the tray near the door. For once in his life, he wasn't sure what he'd find when he stepped outside. But he stepped out anyway, and behind him, the door clicked shut. St. Mary's General Hospital, 12:31 a.m. The corridor stretched endlessly in sterile white, interrupted only by soft fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead like a distant swarm. Edric's shoes made a muted rhythm against the polished linoleum, each step slow, deliberate, as if his legs had forgotten how to move on command. A nurse led the way, speaking occasionally, but her voice melted into the antiseptic air, absorbed by the silence that blanketed the hospital at this hour. He couldn't process it all. Not yet. The smell hit him first, disinfectant and plastic, the faint trace of latex and something sweeter, like the powdery scent of baby lotion. He wasn't sure if that was real or imagined. His hands remained in the pockets of his coat, as though refusing to emerge into this new, surreal world. Somewhere to his right, an infant wailed. The sound sliced through him, unexpected and raw. The nurse paused in front of a frosted glass door marked NICU, authorized personnel only. She turned to face him, her expression gentle but tired, as if she'd delivered this kind of news too many times, and it never got easier. "She's stable," the nurse said softly, breathing on her own, strong reflexes. "That's a good sign." Edric nodded, though he wasn't sure what she expected him to say. The facts didn't fit inside him yet. They clattered around the edges of his mind like loose change in an empty drawer. The nurse handed him something wrapped in a clear plastic sleeve, a hospital-issued envelope. "Before you see her," she said, "there's something the mother left. For you." He took it with both hands. It felt heavier than it should. His fingers hesitated at the seal, trembling just slightly, enough that he noticed, and clenched them harder. Not now. He forced the envelope open. Inside, folded neatly, was a single page of lined stationery. Her handwriting, unmistakable. Still round and precise, like she always wrote, as if someone else would be grading it. Olivia. He read the letter standing there, his breath shallow. There were no grand declarations, no guilt, just Olivia in her plain, stubborn honesty. "If you're reading this, it means I'm not there to say it out loud, and I hate that. But I knew this might happen. I need you to know. Lila wasn't an accident. I chose her, chose to have her, chose to love her. And I know you. I know the man you used to be, before all of this. The man who held my hand under a streetlight because he was scared of losing me. I believe he's still there. Be present. She needs that version of you. Not the perfect one, just the honest one." Behind the letter, another slip of paper had fallen halfway out, torn from a notepad. Ink smudged at the edge, clearly rushed. Fewer words this time, short and sharp. "If you're reading this, she made it to you. Be better than you were. For her." "Oh." He folded the paper slowly, not because he was done, but because he wasn't ready to look at it any longer. The nurse said nothing, just waited. She then held out something else, a tiny, soft blue wristband. "Her identification tag," she said. The name printed on the band was too small for him to read at first. He held it closer, the fluorescent lights bouncing off the glossy surface. His eyes stopped at the name. Lila Bennett, December 31st, 2024. The letters made his stomach knot. Bennett, not Harris. Of course, it was her name, Olivia's. But it wasn't just a name. It was a sign, a subtle, quiet wall between him and the child that waited behind the door. A signal that he'd not been there, that he'd been irrelevant when it counted, that she had prepared to raise Lila without him. He closed his hand around the band, gently. The nurse opened the NICU door. Inside, the world shifted. Everything narrowed, hushed lighting, the mechanical rhythm of breathing machines, the faint whir of filtered air. Rows of tiny incubators glowed like small stars in the dark. He followed her silently until she stopped beside one near the window. "She's right here." Edric stepped closer, and then he saw her. Lila. She was wrapped in a soft pink swaddle, her head barely the size of his palm. Wisps of dark hair curled against her forehead. Her skin was warm-toned and translucent, like fragile silk. She didn't move, just breathed, steadily. The rise and fall of her chest were nearly imperceptible. There was no music, no poetic overture, just the quiet beep, beep, beep of the monitor beside her, each pulse a steady drumbeat that somehow replaced his own. He stood still, too still. In all the years he had run companies, made impossible deals, cut through negotiations like a blade, he had never felt this helpless, this disarmed. Lila didn't know who he was, didn't care, yet she was here, breathing, because of a woman who had once believed in a version of him that even he had forgotten. He bent forward slowly, placing both hands on the edge of the incubator, unsure if it was allowed. His breath caught when her tiny fingers twitched. Her eyes didn't open, but her hand, fist curled, shifted. Without thinking, Edric slipped his index finger just under the opening of the swaddle. Lila's hand found him. It closed, soft but sure, around his finger, and in that moment the space between them collapsed. He didn't cry, not exactly, but something behind his eyes burned, unfamiliar and sharp, as if every version of himself he had built, every layer, every armor, had suddenly cracked. She held on, not because she knew him, but because he was there. And that was enough. 1 week later, Lila was taken to the penthouse by Edric. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the penthouse floor. Edric stepped out with Lila in his arms, the oversized hospital-issued carrier hanging awkwardly from his shoulder. The doors slid closed behind him, sealing them into a world that suddenly felt far too large. The space was quiet, too quiet. His penthouse, immaculate, angular, stainless steel and slate grey, looked almost clinical now. Expansive glass walls revealed the skyline of Chicago, washed in early afternoon light. His steps echoed on polished concrete as he crossed the living room. The sound of his shoes, the soft rustle of Lila's swaddle, those were the only sounds. She made no fuss. Not yet. She was asleep again, mouth slightly open, breath warm against his chest, still wrapped in the faded scarf that had belonged to Olivia. It wasn't a standard issue. The hospital staff had said nothing when they handed it over, just tucked it around Lila like a whisper. Edric recognized it immediately. Pale lavender wool, worn thin at the edges, faintly smelling of the same lemongrass soap Olivia had used in the summer. He had forgotten that scent until it found him again, on this threadbare piece of her. He wanted to unwrap Lila, to tuck her into something clean and new, but his fingers paused. The scarf was the only thing she'd ever been wrapped in by her mother. Removing it felt like taking away a connection he didn't deserve to interfere with. So instead, he folded it carefully. He didn't put it away. He just laid it atop the bookshelf in the hallway, on a shelf that had been empty for years. Something about seeing it there unsettled him. like it didn't belong in this place where everything was curated and detached. But neither did she, neither did he now. The nursery wasn't a nursery at all. It had been a guest room once, then a reading room. Now, it was just a blank room with cold, hardwood floors and blank walls. There was a crib still half assembled in the corner. The instruction manual sat open on the floor, dog-eared and forgotten. Edric hadn't finished putting it together. Instead, he had borrowed the bassinet from the hospital. Its plastic frame and soft mesh sides looked cheap against the expensive backdrop of his penthouse. But it was the only thing ready. He laid Lila inside, adjusting her head slowly. She stirred slightly, a soft grunt of protest, but then settled. Edric stepped back and just stood there. He didn't know what he was waiting for. Some kind of cue, some instinct he didn't have. He checked the baby monitor twice, adjusted the little camera as if it made a difference. The silence of the room buzzed around him. Then the first cry came. It started low, a hesitant whimper, and then rose quickly into a sharp, high-pitched wail that filled the entire apartment like an alarm. Edric flinched. It was louder than he expected. Lila's face turned red, her arms jerking beneath the swaddle. He rushed back to the bassinet, unsure of where to put his hands. Okay, he muttered, trying to sound calm. I'm here. He lifted her the way he had seen the nurse do, under the arms, careful of the neck. But Lila's body arched, and the cry sharpened, rising into something shrill and almost offended. He rocked her, bouncing slightly. Come on. Please, just... He stopped. His voice cracked. He didn't even know what he was asking. Nothing worked. Her cries grew louder. Her legs kicked free of the swaddle, one sock falling to the floor. Edric looked down at her tiny foot, trembling, pink and cold against his suit. The helplessness flooded in, a tight knot in his throat. He sat down, right there on the floor, Lila in his arms, his back pressed against the wall beneath the giant clock that ticked above him. Every second marked by a click that sounded louder now, mocking almost. Tick, tick, tick. Each one a reminder that he was losing time and control. He tried adjusting his hold again. She squirmed and wailed harder. And then a voice. May I? He looked up. Margaret stood in the doorway, mid-50s, practical clothes, a canvas bag still slung over her shoulder. She had the kind of presence that didn't rush, didn't intrude, but simply was. Edric blinked. She won't stop. Margaret nodded once. She's hungry, likely overtired too. He hesitated, then, wordlessly, held Lila out. Margaret's hands were steady as she took the baby. The shift was instant. Lila's cry softened, then hiccuped. Margaret cradled her close, walking slowly in a small rhythm through the room, murmuring low, almost inaudibly. Within moments, the crying stopped. Edric stared. There was no magic to it, no trick, just ease, familiarity. She moved like someone who had done this 1,000 times, and Lila melted into her chest without resistance. A strange heat crept up the back of his neck. It wasn't just relief. It was something else, something uncomfortable, jealousy. He wasn't proud of it. But as he watched Margaret hold Lila, soothing her like it was the most natural thing in the world, he felt like a stranger in his own home. A man watching two people connect through a glass wall he couldn't touch. Margaret turned, offering a small smile. Let me take care of her for a bit. You look like you could use a minute. He nodded. Thanks. He stayed seated as she walked away, down the hall, Lila resting quietly in her arms. The rhythm of her footsteps faded into the apartment's silence. Edric stared at the scarf on the shelf, then at the clock. Tick, tick. He ran a hand down his face. His home had never been loud, never been warm, never been messy. Now, it was all three. And somehow, despite everything, it felt more alive than ever. Yet he'd never felt more like he didn't belong inside it. The morning light drifted slowly into the apartment, like a reluctant guest. It filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long lines across the marble floor. Edric stood barefoot in the kitchen, bottle in hand, swishing warmed milk in practiced circles. He'd learned the exact temperature the night before, after 2 failed attempts and one particularly sharp scream from Lila that had echoed like judgment off the glass walls. Margaret had shown him how to test it on his wrist. "Not too hot, not too cold," she'd said, guiding his hand. He remembered the way her voice didn't carry instructions like orders, but offerings. He hadn't asked for help. He never did, but she gave it anyway. Now he held Lila in the crook of one arm, the bottle angled carefully. She drank without fuss. Her tiny fingers clutched the edge of his shirt. He still didn't know if he was doing it right, but she wasn't crying. That was enough, for now. Later that day, he stood at the threshold of the guest room, her room now, with a towel draped over his shoulder and Lila squirming softly in his arms. The small inflatable tub Margaret had set up sat on the floor, half full. Steam rose faintly, curling toward the ceiling. He lowered her carefully. The water lapped up her legs, and she startled, arms flailing. A small whimper escaped her lips. "Hey, it's okay," Edric whispered, his hands trembling slightly as he supported her neck and back. Just water, nothing to be afraid of. But the fear wasn't hers. It was his. What if he dropped her? What if the water was too warm? What if she slipped? What if something so simple became something irreversible? He'd spent a lifetime mastering risk, but none of it had prepared him for this. Bathing a child so small, so impossibly soft, she felt more like breath than body. As he reached for the towel, something caught his eye. A faint red mark along the inside of her wrist. It wasn't deep. Likely from the ID band the hospital had secured a bit too tightly. But his stomach twisted. He touched it gently, barely grazing the skin with his thumb. Her skin was unmarked everywhere else. The tiniest bruise on her body felt like a threat. Like failure. Like permission for doubt to bloom. He examined every inch. Elbows, knees, ankles, nothing else. Just the one faint spot. Still, something in him snapped taut. "If anyone hurts you," he murmured, almost to himself, "they'll have to go through me first." Lila blinked up at him, eyes wide and unfocused. He didn't know if she heard, if she understood. But in that moment, he meant every word with the clarity of a man who had never protected anything before and now had something he couldn't afford to lose. He wrapped her in a towel, drying her slowly. She cooed softly, nuzzling against the crook of his neck. Her warmth seeped through the fabric, grounding him. An hour later, he stood in the living room, with her nestled in his arms, swaying gently near the window. His phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. He answered without thinking. "Mr. Harris." The voice was clipped, polite. "This is Child Vital Records. We're finalizing the birth certificate for Olivia Bennett's child. We just need verbal confirmation." Edric's chest tightened. "We're listing the child's name as Lila Bennett. Are you confirming that you are the father?" He didn't speak for a long beat. His mouth opened, then closed again. The name Bennett echoed inside his skull like a bell. Olivia's name, her legacy, her fight. But he was here now. He looked down at the baby in his arms. She was sleeping. Her fingers clung to his collar like she'd known him forever. "Yes," he said, the word cracking quietly. "Yes, I'm her father." There was a pause on the line, then a thank you, and the line clicked dead. He stared out over the city. It wasn't just a name anymore. That night, Margaret took the late shift. Edric sat at his desk, the overhead light dimmed to a soft amber glow. The form was open on his tablet. Certificate of live birth. Mother, Olivia Bennett. Father, Edric Harris. He scrolled down slowly, reading each field as if the meaning might change. And then he reached the signature line. He picked up his pen. His hand didn't shake when he signed multi-million-dollar deals. It didn't shake when he cut entire departments to save percentages. But it shook now. Not violently, just enough to feel it, to know that this signature wasn't about power or control. It was about surrender. He stared at his name once it was written. Edric Harris, next to Lila Bennett. Two names, connected now by blood, by ink, by choice. He set the pen down, leaned back in his chair, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. There was no relief, only the weight of what he had just done, not claimed, not rescued, but accepted. For the first time in his life, he had signed something that couldn't be renegotiated, or rewritten, or spun. Something that didn't just define her, it defined him. He walked into her room later that night. She was asleep, mouth open slightly, arms raised, as if reaching for something even in her dreams. He leaned over the bassinet, touched her cheek with the back of his finger. Lila, he whispered. Her eyes fluttered open, just for a moment. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. But she looked at him. And that was enough. But the nights stretched like wire, thin, humming, tense. Edric had lost count of them, not in the romantic, poetic sense, in the literal one. Somewhere between the third and fourth all-nighter, his phone's calendar stopped feeling like a tool and more like an insult. Alarms buzzed with a precision he once respected. Now they were irrelevant. Lila cried long before they rang. He didn't need reminders anymore. At 2:07 a.m., Edric was already awake when the monitor blinked red. The muffled sound of her cry filtered through the speaker, urgent and unsure. He rolled off the couch, blanket half draped over his legs, and padded barefoot into her room. The hardwood was cold beneath his soles, but his body moved on instinct now. The aching joints, the stiffness in his neck, the faint, persistent throb behind his right eye. These had become constants. Lila was already writhing when he leaned over the bassinet. Her legs kicked, fists balled tight, face crumpled with rage. "What is it, huh?" he asked softly, voice hoarse from sleep he didn't remember having. Hunger, gas, existential dread. She wailed louder. He reached for her, more confidently than he had a week ago, and cradled her against his chest. She thrashed, unconvinced. He began the slow rock that had become his go-to, left, right, sway in rhythm with the low hum of the air conditioner. The bottle was on the warmer. Too hot. He cursed under his breath, fumbling with the lid. Steam rose, scalded his thumb. He dropped the cap. Milk splashed across the counter. Behind him, Lila's cries hit their peak. It was 2:19 a.m. He was on his knees by 2:22, cleaning up with one hand while trying to keep her from sliding off his shoulder. The spilled milk soaked into the bottom edge of a post-it on the fridge, warping the paper. He noticed it too late. How to sterilize a bottle. Remember to cool before feeding. The ink was smudged. His handwriting, usually exact, measured, looked like a stranger's. More notes were scattered across the kitchen and hallway. Burp between ounces. Check neck for drool. If temp greater than 99.5 degrees, call Margaret. Some were peeling off. Others were smeared with formula or folded under the weight of coffee mugs hastily set down. One was stuck to the back of his hand all night, and he hadn't noticed until Margaret pointed it out. He was unraveling, but not collapsing. He was adapting. Badly, maybe, but earnestly. At 3:08 a.m. he finally fed her. She drank grudgingly, then passed out mid-suckle. He didn't dare move. He stood there, half bent over the bassinet, her breath warm against his forearm, her fingers wrapped tightly around his shirt. That morning, while cradling her through another bout of fussing, Margaret called. "I think she has a low fever," he said quickly, without preamble. "Not high, but I need to know what to do." There was a pause on the line. Margaret's voice came steady. "Did she feel warm to the touch?" "Yes, but not flushed, I think. Maybe I'm being—" He stopped. There was silence. "I think my daughter has a fever," he said again, this time slower, more certain. It wasn't just the words that struck him. It was the way they came out, without thought, without pretense, like muscle memory. He didn't say Olivia's daughter, or the baby. He said my daughter. He hung up after taking her advice. Lukewarm bath, keep her close, monitor. Lila dozed again on his chest, her fever fading. By the time the sky began to warm, bleeding soft orange into the steel-grey skyline, Edric's body was humming with fatigue. He hadn't showered in 2 days. His t-shirt was inside out. He'd stepped in a puddle of formula and not even changed socks. But Lila was breathing softly. Her little hand, tucked into the fold of his collar, rose and fell with each breath. He sat on the edge of the couch and stared out the window. No news channels, no email, just the slow throb of traffic below, the blinking tail lights of a city that hadn't paused once since she'd come home. He began to hum, just to stay awake. It was a tune he hadn't thought about in years, one Olivia used to sing when she cooked, one that played in that divey bar they used to love. The melody wasn't cheerful or sad, just simple, familiar. He hummed the same bars over and over. Then he added words, quietly, barely above a whisper. He didn't notice that Lila was watching him until he looked down. She was staring up, her mouth open, her eyes wide and curious. Then, almost imperceptibly, her lips curled. A smile, a real one, not the fleeting gas reflexes they warned him about. His breath caught. The world didn't shift. No violins played. No sunbeam lit her perfectly from above. But inside him, something broke open. Not like a wound, but like a window. A crack of warmth in the cold house he'd built around his life. She smiled. At him. And he smiled back. Not with triumph. Not with pride. Just relief. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead. "That's the first time you've laughed at me," he murmured. "I should be offended." She blinked, her tiny hand curled against his chest. It was 5:01 a.m. when she fell asleep again. And for the first time since bringing her home, Edric didn't dread the next cry. He knew it would come. In 30 minutes, maybe less. But he'd be there. Because he understood now. Lila wasn't crying at him. She was crying to him. And that made all the difference. The new day started like any other. But today there seems to be something unusual. It started with a headline. Edric didn't see it right away. Margaret was the one who brought the printout into the kitchen, wordlessly placing it beside his coffee as he tried, unsuccessfully, to burp Lila over his shoulder. The baby let out a wet hiccup. Edric rubbed her back, then glanced down. Billionaire Edric Harris and his secret daughter, first photos inside. Below the headline, a grainy photo of him holding Lila near the window, her head tucked beneath his chin, her body swaddled in the same lavender scarf that once belonged to Olivia. The mug in his hand went still. He read the piece once, then again. The words were intrusive, half-true, and written with just enough plausibility to feel dangerous. There was no name for Lila only the infant or the mystery child. But they had named Olivia. They mentioned her death, speculated about the timing. They'd even included a cropped picture of Olivia from years ago, her face hardened by the grain, made anonymous by time. Margaret waited for him to say something. He didn't. He just stood up and carried Lila into the nursery, door closing behind him with a soft click. By noon, his phone had rung 17 times. His PR team, 2 journalists he hadn't spoken to in years, a woman claiming to be from People, one from Forbes, then texts. By 2 p.m., paparazzi were camped outside the building. He saw them through the surveillance feed, black SUVs with tinted windows, a man sitting on the roof of a van with a zoom lens longer than his forearm. One of them wore a delivery uniform. Another pretended to walk a dog. Edric turned off the feed. Then he went room to room, checking every curtain, every lock, every window. Margaret watched silently. That night, he got an email from security. One of the building's night guards had sold a confirmation to the press. Yes, there's a baby up there. That's all it took. A few words, a few $1,000s. The guard had been let go. Edric asked to meet him anyway. They sat in the lobby after hours, in a quiet corner where no cameras reached. The man was younger than he remembered, pale, nervous, wringing his hands. "I didn't mean harm, sir," he said. "I didn't think it would get so big." Edric didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He only asked one question, voice low even. "Did you think about her before you took the money?" The man didn't answer. He didn't have to. For the next 3 days, the outside world turned rabid. Drones buzzed the windows at dusk. Reporters slipped notes to doormen. Emails flooded in from charities, influencers, strangers claiming to have been close to Olivia, people offering to tell her story. Some asked for interviews, others offered legal advice. One wanted to sell him a book deal. Edric read none of it. Instead, he silenced his phone, declined calls, cancelled meetings, closed his calendar for the month. He turned inward. Margaret noticed it first. His shoulders, once held upright even in exhaustion, were now constantly tensed. He snapped when the microwave beeped, when the baby monitor clicked, when the doorbell rang twice in 1 hour. At one point, a friend from his university days, someone he hadn't spoken to in 6 years, showed up uninvited at the concierge desk. Edric told them never to let that happen again. He cancelled deliveries, declined guests, no mail, no housekeepers, no cleaners. The penthouse became a fortress, and Edric, its self-appointed warden. He hovered, over Lila's crib, over the cameras, over the curtains. At night, he'd stand with arms crossed, watching the skyline with silent fury, as if daring the city to try and take something else from him. One afternoon, he began sketching out escape plans in a notebook, renting a second property, changing identities, moving to the coast, a place with trees, fewer neighbors, less visibility. He showed none of it to Margaret, but she saw the signs. It was during a lull in the day, Lila asleep, the sun stretching gold across the hardwood, that Edric dreamt. Not truly asleep, more like nodding off in the chair near her crib, exhaustion folding him in half. In the dream, he was outside, in a crowd. Flashbulbs exploded in every direction, the world white-hot with noise and frenzy. He held Lila to his chest, but she was crying, screaming, really. And no matter how tightly he held her, how desperately he moved through the crowd, the cameras never stopped, the faces never blurred. She just kept crying, louder, rawer, until the sound filled his ears and eclipsed everything. He tried to shout, to scream, "Stop!" But his voice didn't work. He woke with a jolt, the sound of silence suddenly too sharp. He stumbled into her room. She was there, asleep, breathing, still his. He sank to the floor beside her crib and stayed there until the light changed. That evening, He was reviewing security footage again, fast-forwarding through another uneventful day of shadows pacing near the parking garage, when Margaret approached quietly. She didn't knock. She didn't ask. She placed her hand on his shoulder. He tensed, out of habit more than resistance. "She needs a father," she said gently. "Not a superhero." He turned toward her, slowly. His expression was unreadable, but his shoulders slumped. "I can't protect her," he said after a moment. "Not really. Not from all this." "No one can," Margaret said. "But you can be there. That's the part she'll remember." He nodded. It was small, but it was real. That night, Lila stirred amid the noise of another helicopter circling overhead. Edric walked to her room, picked her up without speaking, and carried her to the farthest room in the penthouse. The quietest corner. No windows. He laid her on his chest, heartbeat steady. Outside, headlines flashed, rumors churned, clicks climbed. Inside, Lila slept. And Edric, still, alert, breath synced with hers, knew something he hadn't known before. He could lose money, he could lose legacy, he could lose control. But this tiny weight against his ribs, this breath on his collarbone, this soft sigh, this was the first thing he'd ever had that made the world outside feel smaller than the one in his arms. And for the first time, in a very long time. He let the noise fade and just listened to her sleep. One afternoon, while Edric was looking for a tax document, a dull, bureaucratic chase, but instead, what slid out into the open was a small, bent postcard. Its corners were curled, the ink slightly faded. He stared at it, a watercolor print of Portland's rainy skyline, the kind you'd find at a gas station. On the back, a familiar looping script. "If you ever need a place to breathe, you know where to find me. Emma 7 years ago." He hadn't answered. He picked up the phone and dialed. Emma arrived 2 days later, her coat soaked from the February drizzle, a brown tote on one shoulder and a bag of groceries in the other. She looked exactly as he remembered, half chaotic, eyes knowing, the kind of woman who wore her history like an old denim jacket. The moment she stepped into the penthouse, she paused. This place smells like someone lit a candle in a boardroom and hoped for the best. Edric let out a small laugh, the first in days. "You always did know how to set a tone." Emma's gaze drifted toward the bassinet near the window, where Lila lay, dozing. She walked over without asking, leaned in and whispered, "Hi, tiny person. You have no idea how big a dent you've made in this man's armor." Dinner that night was homemade, Emma's version of comfort food. Chicken soup, over-toasted bread, salad drowning in dressing. Edric tried to help, but mostly ended up chopping the garlic too fine and burning the rice. They didn't care. The kitchen lights were warm, golden. Lila sat in her bouncer seat between them, gurgling with half-amused indifference. Edric attempted to feed her mashed sweet potatoes, missing her mouth more than once. A glob landed on the table. He groaned. Emma slid a napkin toward him, grinning. "Billion-dollar man loses to a 4-month-old. I'm honored to witness this." He smiled. "I've closed impossible deals, boardroom wars, arbitration sessions in Hong Kong. But this is the hardest negotiation I've ever had. Because this one actually matters," she said quietly. There was a pause. The soup bubbled on the stove. Lila kicked her feet. Edric looked at his cousin across the table, the girl who used to steal his pencils, who once patched his split lip in middle school, who had seen him before he built the armor, before the fortune, before the isolation. He felt something soften. After dinner, Emma took Lila in her arms and walked around the living room, humming under her breath. Lila, groggy, stirred slightly, then blinked up, and in that small silence, her little hand reached out, and brushed against Emma's cheek. Emma froze, then smiled. Edric stood still in the kitchen, holding a dish towel, watching. His heart did something strange. He didn't speak, but he smiled too, genuine, easy, a muscle long unused returning to function. Later that week, Daniel called. Old friend, college roommate, now a father of 3. He'd seen the photos online, but hadn't reached out, until he heard through a mutual friend that Edric had started answering his phone again. They met in a quiet bar in the basement of a boutique hotel. Daniel's choice. "No one bothers you here," he said, "and the bartender doesn't ask questions." They talked for 2 hours. Daniel spoke of parenthood like it was war, and wonder rolled into one. "There's no handbook," he said, nursing a beer. "Just guesswork and survival. You think the sleepless nights are the worst, but it's not that. It's the knowing you're always one breath away from screwing everything up." Edric nodded, slowly. His glass sat untouched. "You're used to control," Daniel added. "But this humbles you faster than failure ever could." "Yeah," Edric said. "It really does." They didn't hug goodbye. They weren't that kind of friendship. But as Edric turned to leave, Daniel said, "Don't disappear again. You're not the only one figuring it out." A week later, his laptop pinged with a Zoom call. The name on the screen made his breath hitch. Marissa, his former co-founder, his mirror in ambition, his rival in silence. She had left the company 5 years ago, citing creative divergence. Edric hadn't spoken to her since. He answered. She appeared on screen, no makeup, hoodie, hair pulled back. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week. "Hey," she said casually. "Heard you're finally human." He blinked, then exhaled a laugh. "That's generous." "I didn't call to talk shop," she added. "I just wanted to say congrats. Not on the baby, on surviving yourself." There was a pause. He nodded. They talked about nothing for 20 minutes. Old memories, dumb mistakes, the time they almost named their company something embarrassing. Then she said, "Keep in touch this time, yeah?" "I will." And he meant it. That night, Edric sat in the nursery, Lila asleep against his chest. The soft whir of the baby monitor, the occasional creak of the wood under his feet. He leaned back in the rocking chair and looked out into the dark, empty skyline. She shifted in her sleep, fingers closing around the edge of his shirt. He whispered, "You don't know this. Not yet. But you saved me from someone I didn't even know I hated becoming." The words came out rough, quiet, honest. The following morning was uneventful, but something had shifted. In the kitchen, Margaret sipped her tea at the counter while Emma loaded the dishwasher. A baby toy lay on the floor. A dish towel hung from a cabinet. It wasn't perfect, but it was warm. Edric walked in, barefoot, cradling Lila, her head buried against his neck. He looked around the room, and for the first time in years, perhaps ever, he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel like a man trying to control a house, a narrative, a legacy. He felt like a man standing inside something that finally felt like home. Lila stirred, yawned. Emma reached to tickle her chin. Margaret handed Edric a clean bottle without a word. The morning light washed over all 3 of them. A new day, and finally, a family. Edric thought for a long time and decided to do something he should have done a long time ago. Today, he would visit Olivia's grave. He stood at the door longer than he needed to. The lavender scarf sat on the hallway table, folded with more care than any item of clothing had ever deserved in his home. It wasn't fancy, just worn wool, faded at the edges, but it had wrapped Lila on her first night in the world. It had once belonged to Olivia. It was the first thing their daughter ever knew of her. Edric slipped it gently into the inner pocket of his coat. He didn't bring flowers. That felt performative, hollow. But the scarf. This meant something. The cemetery was quiet, in the way only winter can make a place quiet. Damp earth. Bare trees. The kind of stillness that wasn't peace, but pause. Everything under the surface was waiting for something to bloom again. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes. No one else walked the rows of stones, except for a woman in the distance, stooped, slow, kneeling beside a grave. A bouquet of wilting lilies sat beside her. Olivia's plot was near the back, tucked under a spindly dogwood tree that had long since shed its leaves. The headstone was simple, grey, newer than the rest. No grand inscription, just her name, her years. And beneath it, a short line he hadn't chosen. Loved freely. Lived honestly. He crouched. The wind tugged at his coat, tried to steal the silence. He didn't speak right away, just took out the scarf, unfolded it carefully, and laid it across the base of the stone. It fluttered a little before settling. She needed this more than I did, he murmured, brushing a corner flat. But now, it's yours, again. He sat back on his heels, eyes tracing the carved letters. I didn't know what to bring, he said, finally. Flowers didn't feel like us. You never liked the ones I picked anyway. He exhaled, the cloud of breath vanishing fast in the cold. His fingers dug into the damp soil, not tightly, just enough to ground him. I'm sorry, he said. I should have been better. Earlier. The words hung in the air, raw, unpolished. I kept thinking I'd have time to fix it. We both did, I think. I was so sure you'd be there, that there'd be a moment, somewhere down the line, where I'd be ready. But life didn't wait. His voice caught for a second. He didn't force it forward. You were right, by the way, about me, about Lila. His gaze shifted to the tree overhead, bare limbs twisting skyward. I thought love had to be earned in exact measures, proved, contained, but you just gave it, even when I didn't deserve it. And now I'm learning how. A rustle behind him. Edric turned. The woman he'd seen earlier was closer now, standing a few feet away. Her coat was wool, a soft plaid, her gloves mismatched. She gave him a polite, quiet nod. Didn't mean to interrupt, she said, voice creaky with age. Just, sometimes it's nice to know someone else is talking to the silence too. He gave a tired smile. It's my first time here. She walked closer, unbothered by the cold. In her hand was a damp tissue. First visits are hard, she said, then looked down at the grave. Yours. Yes, Edric said. Then, a beat. Was. The woman nodded. She pulled something from her pocket and held it out to him. A clean tissue. You don't stop talking to them, she said softly. Even when they stop answering. He accepted it with a nod. She didn't stay long, just rested her hand gently on his shoulder before walking back down the gravel path. Alone again, Edric leaned forward, elbows on knees. A memory came, slow and uninvited. He and Olivia standing by her car, the storm soaking through her red dress. She'd just said something. He couldn't remember what, but her eyes had waited for him to say it back, to fight for her, to choose her. He hadn't. I was too proud to listen, he whispered, and you were too tired to repeat yourself. His hands curled against the fabric of his coat. The wind picked up again. From somewhere above, a crow called once, then went quiet. He reached out, touched the smooth top of the headstone. His hand rested there. Thank you, he said, for believing in me more than I ever did. A single drop of rain fell, soft, sudden, landing on the back of his hand. He froze, then let out a breath, barely a laugh. "Yeah," he said, glancing up. "I get it." He stayed a while longer, not talking, just being there. And before he stood, he did one more thing. He took out his phone. No angles, no filters. Just one photo. The scarf. The stone. Her name. He titled the image, "Lila, Mom," saved it, locked it. Not for today. But someday when she asked. When Edric returned to the car, the engine was cold. He sat for a long while before starting it. He didn't feel lighter. Closure wasn't a door you walked through and left behind. It was more like a window. Sometimes you opened it, just enough to let the air in. But he had said the things that needed saying, and she'd listened in the only way they could. As he drove off, the rain came, not heavy, but steady. And in the back seat, Lila stirred in her sleep, still breathing, still here. In memory of Olivia and other single parents, Edric founded the Olivia's Light Foundation, which provides medical, legal, and psychological support to single-parent families across the United States. The name came from Emma. They were sitting at the long oak table in the dining room, the one Edric had once used to host investors and board members. Now, it was covered in paper, notes, printouts, staff bios, zoning regulations. He had spent the morning pitching names that sounded clean, polished, marketable. New Horizons, the Second Start Initiative, Haven Works. Emma didn't interrupt. She just waited. And when he finally paused to sip his coffee, she slid a folded sheet of paper toward him. Scrawled across the center, in her familiar script, were 3 words: Olivia's Light. He stared at it for a long time, said nothing. That night, alone in the study, he wrote the name out 5 times, each time a little slower, a little surer. And by the 5th, he knew he wasn't going to call it anything else. The office space wasn't glass and chrome. He didn't want that. It was an old converted library building in the South Loop. Brick walls, high windows, sunlight pooling on the floor in long rectangles. He chose it because it felt lived in, safe, like something that had been held together more by care than concrete. Edric walked every square foot of it, not as a CEO, but as a builder. He measured where the playroom would go, sat in the corner that would become the intake area, pushed open every creaky closet door. At one point, he knelt and ran his hand along a cracked baseboard and murmured, "We can fix this." Margaret smiled from the doorway. She'd like that. They didn't just hire on qualifications. Edric insisted on being present for each interview. He read every resume, even the ones with typos or missing credentials. The team flagged him when a woman came in, early 30s, former nursing student, single mother, dropped out during her 2nd trimester, no recent job experience. During the interview, she sat with her back straight, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her voice was steady, but her eyes kept flicking to the door, as if bracing to be dismissed. Edric leaned forward. "If you were Olivia?" he asked. "What would you have needed most?" The woman blinked, thrown. Then her voice lowered. "I wouldn't need pity," she said. "I'd need someone to believe that I still matter." Silence stretched between them. Then Edric nodded slowly. He crossed off 3 other candidates that afternoon. Perfect resumes, polished answers, 0 heart. The day they opened the doors, Lila ran through the office barefoot, holding a marker in one hand and a half-eaten cracker in the other. The space wasn't finished, furniture half-assembled, welcome desk unpainted, but it was real. People were already arriving, volunteers, mothers, babies in slings and strollers. Edric knelt to tie Lila's shoe when she dropped the marker and trotted to the glass wall of the main conference room. She pressed her hands against it, then turned to Emma with a grin. "Mama," she said, tapping the window. Edric froze. Emma looked up, gently. She's talking about the drawing, I think. On the other side of the glass, a new doodle appeared. 5 crayon suns, a blue squiggle labelled Home, and a stick figure with a circle in its belly. Lila beamed and pointed at it. Mama House. She had drawn it during a quiet hour that morning while Edric was on a call. No one had noticed until now. An intern reached to remove it later, thinking it was just childish clutter on company glass. But Edric stopped him. "Leave it," he said. "It belongs." Word spread. By the second month, the intake list had doubled. So had the donations. Edric refused to let the foundation grow too fast. Every expansion was intentional. Every hire was personal. He visited shelters, talked with social workers, held babies while their mothers filled out forms. He didn't bring cameras, didn't give speeches, but he listened. He showed up. And slowly, the wound inside him, the one Olivia's absence had carved, began to ache less. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just reacting to loss. He was building from it. Late one afternoon, as rain whispered against the windows, a young woman stepped through the front door. She wore a faded hoodie, old sneakers soaked through, and held a sleeping infant in a worn grey sling. Her hair was pulled back messily, a tear in the elbow of her sleeve. But her eyes were unflinching. Edric saw her before the receptionist did. She didn't approach the desk. She stood just inside the door, rocking slightly, scanning the room. When Edric approached, she didn't flinch. She simply looked up, tired but proud. "Do I need a letter from someone to prove I deserve help?" she asked. Not pleading, not accusing, just asking. Edric's throat tightened. Olivia had asked for so little, had carried so much alone, had refused to beg the world for space she should have always had. He looked at the young mother, and he saw her, not just the resemblance, but the courage. He didn't answer right away. He just nodded. "You're in the right place," he said softly. She exhaled, just once. And for the first time that day, she smiled. That evening, after the last family had left, Edric walked the halls alone. He paused in front of the glass wall. The crayon drawing was still there, smudged now, sun-faded, but intact. Below it, Lila had added a new figure, shorter, next to the stick figure labelled Mama. It had spiky lines for hair. Edric smiled. He traced the new figure with one finger and whispered, "Daddy's home too." 1 year later, New Year's Eve again. The penthouse didn't look like it used to. The cold steel and stark glass had softened. Rugs warmed the floors, finger-painted canvases lined the hallway, and in the living room, a small wooden train set looped under the base of a modest pine tree, wrapped in mismatched lights. The walls bore new history. Photographs, dozens of them, some framed, some taped up haphazardly. Lila crawling on the rug with a sock in her mouth. Her first gummy smile. Her hand wrapped around Edric's thumb. A grainy image of her asleep on his chest, the curve of her face identical to Olivia's. And just above the dining table, a candid shot taken by Emma, one Edric hadn't noticed at first, him and Lila laughing, her arms thrown around his neck, hair in his face. He hadn't seen himself smile like that before. Now he walked through the apartment barefoot, a bottle of sparkling cider in one hand, watching as people filled the space he once feared would remain empty forever. Margaret stirred something warm in the kitchen. Daniel and his wife sat cross-legged on the rug, building block towers with their kids. Marissa was near the stereo, scrolling through playlists, while Lila clung to her leg. Emma walked out of the nursery, holding a handful of stuffed animals, already laughing as Lila darted around the couch with a squeal of victory. The house hummed with warmth and noise, with belonging. Edric leaned against the doorway, sipping quietly, letting it all settle over him. Not performative, Not overwhelming, just real. Later, while guests nibbled at dessert and kids ran laps around the dining table, Emma found him on the balcony, arms folded, eyes tracing the skyline. "She's fast," she said, stepping beside him. "She is," he replied, voice soft. "Doesn't stop." "She's you," Emma said. He didn't answer right away. Then, "She's better." Emma studied him for a beat, then said, "You know, you keep telling people that Lila saved you." Edric tilted his head, curious. "But she didn't," Emma continued, smiling gently. "She gave you the chance. You're the one who walked back." He looked down, watching Lila through the window as she danced with a sparkler in her hand, trailing light in wide circles. "I still don't know what I'm doing." "No one does," Emma said, "but now you care enough to try. That's the part that matters." At 11:55 p.m., the lights dimmed slightly, and people began drifting toward the balcony or the windows. Someone uncorked a bottle too early, and champagne foamed over the counter. Laughter echoed. Children clambered up onto laps, couches, shoulders. Edric scooped Lila into his arms. She was wide-eyed, already half asleep from too much sugar and running, but still humming under her breath. He stepped onto the balcony, holding her close. The winter air bit at his face, but she pressed against his chest, warm and soft and completely at ease. Then, the countdown began. 10, 9, 8. Lila blinked slowly. He adjusted the hood of her sweater and kissed the top of her head. 7, 6, 5. From across the room, Emma raised her glass. Margaret nodded from behind the kitchen island. Marissa was already counting with the kids. 4, 3, 2. Edric looked down at the city, lit in gold. 1. The sky exploded. Not with sound first, but color. Bursts of crimson, gold, electric blue. Then the rumble followed, deep and slow, echoing off the buildings. Lila gasped. Tiny fingers gripped the collar of his shirt. "Boom," she whispered, eyes wide. "Yeah," Edric murmured. "Boom." More fireworks followed, painting the sky in waves. Reflections danced across the glass towers, refracted in 100 directions. The city was alive. He tightened his arms around her and felt her settle. Then, softly, almost without thinking, he said, "I was lost once." She didn't look up, just nestled deeper into him, face tucked beneath his chin. "But you gave me a map I didn't know I needed. You taught me that beginnings can come after endings, that not everything broken stays that way." The next burst lit the skyline in rose gold. Lila yawned. He kissed her temple. "Thank you for finding me," he whispered, "and for teaching me how to begin again." Lila didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply smiled in her sleep and rested her head against his shoulder. And in that instant, surrounded by laughter, light, and the echo of fireworks, time stilled. No more regret. No more what if. Only now. Only this. Only the quiet, unmistakable knowledge that some loves don't just heal you, they rebuild you from the inside out.